Most people believe time treats everyone equally. Same hours, same days, same years. So the assumption feels logical, that progress should also be equal. But time doesn't create outcomes, it amplifies structure. And structure is never equal. Some people are connected to systems that multiply what they do, others are not. So even if two people apply the same effort, time does not produce the same result, because effort is not what compounds. What effort is attached to does. This is where the difference begins, not in intensity, not in discipline, but in connection. What your actions feed into. If your effort is isolated, it ends when you stop. There is no extension, no continuation. Time has nothing to amplify. If your effort is connected, it continues beyond you. It builds, carries forward, reinforces itself. And now, time has something to multiply. This is why compounding is misunderstood. People think it's automatic, that time alone creates growth. But time only expands what already exists. If nothing continues, nothing compounds. You simply repeat effort across time, and repetition is not growth. So while one person's past work disappears, the other person's past work remains active, still producing, still influencing outcomes, still shaping what comes next. And over time, this creates a difference that feels unfair, because the inputs look similar, but the outputs are not. One person is moving with accumulation, the other is moving with reset. And those two paths do not scale the same way. They diverge. Slowly at first, almost invisible, but consistently. And consistency is enough. Because compounding does not need speed, it needs continuation. And continuation is not evenly distributed. It depends on structure. So when you see someone staying ahead, it's not just because they started earlier. It's because what they built never stopped working. And that is what time is amplifying. Not effort alone, but the system behind it. Early advantage is rarely obvious. It doesn't look like dominance. It doesn't look like control. It looks small. A slightly better position, a slightly better connection, a slightly better starting point. Nothing dramatic, nothing that feels decisive. But compounding doesn't need dramatic. It needs direction. Because once something is moving, even slightly, time begins to reinforce it. Not instantly, not in a way that draws attention, but continuously. That early advantage begins to stack. A better opportunity leads to a better outcome. That outcome creates access to the next level, and the next level introduces new options. Options that weren't available before. This is how small differences expand. Not through effort alone, but through access expanding over time. Each step increases the range of the next step. Meanwhile, someone without that early advantage does not have the same access. They operate within a narrower range, fewer options, fewer connections, fewer opportunities to build on. So even if they move correctly, their path is constrained, not by ability, but by available pathways. And pathways determine outcomes. This is where the divergence strengthens, because one person is expanding their range while the other is still trying to break into it. And breaking in always takes longer than moving within. So time begins to amplify that difference, not because one person is accelerating, but because one person has more directions to move in, more leverage points, more ways to build. And with each cycle, that advantage compounds. More access leads to better positioning. Better positioning leads to stronger outcomes. Stronger outcomes reinforce access again. A loop forms, self-reinforcing, continuous. And once that loop is established, it does not require constant effort to sustain. It sustains itself. Meanwhile, the person without early advantage is still linear. Each step is separate. Each result stands alone. There is no loop, no reinforcement. So progress feels slower. Not because they are incapable, but because nothing is multiplying their movement. Everything must be recreated. And over time, that difference compounds, not through visible jumps, but through quiet expansion. This is why early advantage matters, not because it guarantees success, but because it changes how time interacts with you. It determines whether time multiplies your effort or simply records it. And once time begins multiplying instead of recording, the trajectory shifts. Not instantly, but permanently. Because from that point forward, every step builds more than the last. And that is where the gap begins to expand. Not from one moment, but from a series of reinforced advantages, each one building on the previous. Until eventually, the difference is no longer small. It becomes structural. And structure is what time protects. Because once advantage is built into structure, it no longer depends on constant effort. It becomes part of the system itself. And systems are what sustain separation. Before this continues, if you felt seen instead of sold to, that's the entire point of Relentless Wealth. Like the video, subscribe. We're just getting started. At a certain point, advantage stops looking like advantage. It starts looking like normal. Like this is just how things are. Because once a system begins reinforcing itself, the outcomes it produces feel expected, not exceptional, not surprising, just consistent. This is where feedback loops take control, where results begin to influence future results, where outcomes start shaping the next set of opportunities. A win leads to visibility. Visibility leads to access. Access leads to better opportunities. Better opportunities lead to stronger outcomes. And stronger outcomes reinforce visibility again. The loop tightens, each layer feeding the next, not by force, but by structure. And structure is what makes it stable. This is why certain people don't just move forward, they accelerate. Not because they increase effort, but because the system begins doing more of the work. At this stage, effort becomes leverage. Small inputs, large outputs. Because each action is supported by everything that came before it. Meanwhile, outside of this loop, nothing reinforces itself. A result ends where it finishes. It doesn't create the next opportunity. So the person remains in isolation, each step disconnected, each outcome contained. No carryover, no expansion. And this creates a hidden divide, not in what people are doing, but in how their actions behave after they're done. Inside a feedback loop, action echoes. It continues to influence. It keeps generating movement. It compounds. Outside of it, action ends. No echo, no continuation, just completion. And over time, this difference becomes exponential. Not because one person is scaling effort, but because one person's actions don't disappear. They accumulate, interact, reinforce each other, and eventually, they start producing outcomes on their own, without constant input. This is when the system takes over, when progress is no longer fully dependent on the individual, when the structure begins to move independently. And at that point, catching up becomes difficult. Not because the person ahead is speeding up, but because their system is. Every cycle widens the gap. Every loop reinforces the difference. And the longer it runs, the harder it becomes to interrupt. Because you're not just competing with effort anymore. You're competing with a system that compounds, a system that strengthens itself over time, a system that turns small advantages into sustained separation. And once that loop is established, it doesn't just maintain position, it protects it, quietly, consistently, without needing to be seen. At the beginning, the difference is small, almost unnoticeable. Two people moving at similar speeds, similar effort, similar outcomes. But one of them is connected to a system that compounds, and the other is not. That is where the separation begins. Not in what they are doing, but in what continues after they stop. One builds layers, the other repeats actions. And time does not treat those two paths the same, because time multiplies continuation and ignores repetition. So as time passes, the gap starts to expand. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but consistently. Each cycle reinforces the person with structure, more access, more leverage, more opportunities feeding into each other, while the other remains dependent on effort alone. And eventually, the difference becomes too large to ignore. One person appears far ahead, not because they moved faster, but because they never reset. At that point, the gap feels permanent, not impossible to close, but structurally reinforced. Because you are no longer comparing effort, you are comparing systems, and systems determine outcomes over time. So trying to catch up through effort alone feels ineffective, because effort without structure does not compound. It repeats. This is where the perspective shifts, not toward working harder, but toward changing what your effort connects to. Because the goal is not speed, it's alignment. Alignment with systems that continue. Alignment with structures that multiply. And once that alignment exists, the dynamic changes. Effort starts to carry forward. Results begin to build on themselves. And over time, that is what closes distance. Not by matching someone else's speed, but by changing the way your movement behaves. Because in the end, the people who stay ahead are not just ahead in effort, they are ahead in structure. And structure is what time protects. If you see it now, you won't move the same way again. Like and follow for more.